in the forgotten corners of rural Montana, where the wind whispers secrets through endless wheat fields and small towns cling to life like wildflowers in drought. Some of the most beautiful souls remain hidden from the world. This is the story of Ruby Martinez, a 28-year-old woman with achondroplasia who had spent most of her adult life believing that love was something that happened to other people, the tall, the conventionally beautiful, the ones who fit society's narrow definitions of worthy. Standing just over 4 feet tall, with legs that curved outward and a body that carried extra weight from years of emotional eating, Ruby had convinced herself that romance was as distant as the Montana mountains that ringed her small town of Whispering Creek. But sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, life has a way of proving us wrong. Sometimes, it takes a man of few words but deep understanding to show us that true beauty has nothing to do with the mirror's reflection, and everything to do with the light that shines from within. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. Ruby Martinez pressed her face against the window of Miller's General Store, watching the Saturday morning bustle of Whispering Creek's main street. At 28, she had perfected the art of observing life rather than participating in it. Her reflection stared back at her, round face framed by thick, dark hair, intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the unmistakable features of someone born with achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism that had shaped not just her body, but her entire worldview. "Ruby, honey, could you help me with these inventory sheets?" called Martha Miller from behind the counter. Martha, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the patience of a saint, had given Ruby a job 3 years ago when no one else in town would even consider her application. Working at the general store wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills for her small apartment above the town's only bakery. "Coming, Mrs. Miller," Ruby replied, turning away from the window. As she walked across the store, she caught sight of herself in the security mirror mounted in the corner. The image made her wince. Her gait was distinctive, the way her legs curved outward, making each step a reminder of her difference. At 5 feet 4 inches sitting down, but only 4 feet 2 inches standing, Ruby often felt like she existed in 2 different worlds. The bell above the door chimed, and Ruby looked up to see Jessica Crawford entering with her usual group of friends. Jessica, tall and blonde with the kind of effortless beauty that made heads turn, had been the prom queen, the homecoming queen, and now worked as a receptionist at the town's medical clinic. She was everything Ruby felt she could never be. "Oh my God, did you see what happened at the Harvest Dance last night?" Jessica was saying to her friends, her voice carrying across the small store. "Poor Tommy Peterson tried to ask out that new girl from Billings, but she totally shot him down. I mean, can you blame her? He's barely taller than." Jessica's eyes fell on Ruby, and she stopped mid-sentence. Ruby felt her cheeks burn with familiar shame. She knew how that sentence was supposed to end. Barely taller than the dwarf girl who works at Miller's. She'd heard variations of it her entire life, whispered comparisons that reduced her to a measuring stick for other people's inadequacies. "Hi, Ruby," Jessica said with forced cheerfulness, the kind of overly bright tone people used when they'd been caught saying something cruel. "How are you today?" "Fine," Ruby managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She focused on the inventory sheets in her hands, the numbers blurring together as she fought back tears. After Jessica and her friends left, Ruby escaped to the store's back room, where she allowed herself a moment of private anguish. She pulled out her phone and opened the camera, switching it to selfie mode. The face that looked back at her was round and soft, with a button nose and full cheeks that made her look younger than her years. But all she could see were the flaws, the way her proportions seemed wrong, the way her body took up space in a world that seemed designed for people twice her height. "My legs are crooked," she whispered to her reflection, tears finally spilling over. "I'll never be beautiful." It was a mantra she'd repeated to herself countless times, especially on days like this, when the world seemed particularly unkind. Ruby had learned early that being different meant being invisible in some ways and hypervisible in others. People either stared or looked away too quickly, and both reactions felt like rejection. The afternoon passed slowly, with Ruby mechanically restocking shelves and helping customers who treated her with the polite distance that small-town people maintained with those they considered different. As closing time approached, she was grateful for the prospect of going home to her small apartment, where she could eat ice cream and watch romantic comedies, living vicariously through actresses who looked nothing like her. "Ruby, dear," Mrs. Miller said as she counted the day's receipts, "I need you to make a delivery tomorrow morning. The Hawthorne Ranch ordered a bunch of supplies, and their usual driver is sick. You know the place, about 10 miles out on County Road 15. Ruby nodded, though the thought of venturing beyond the familiar confines of town made her nervous. The Hawthorne Ranch was owned by a man named Caleb, someone she'd heard about but never met. People in town described him as a loner, a quiet man who kept to himself and rarely came into town except for essentials. Some said he was standoffish, others claimed he was just shy. Ruby had always been curious about him, but never imagined she'd have a reason to visit his ranch. That evening, as Ruby prepared for bed in her small apartment, she stood before her full-length mirror and practiced what she might say to this mysterious rancher. "Hello, Mr. Hawthorne. I have your delivery from Miller's." She paused, studying her reflection. Even in her pajamas, she felt awkward and disproportionate. Her legs, curved outward from her hip dysplasia, reminded her daily of her body's differences. Her weight, gained from years of comfort eating and limited mobility, made her feel even more self-conscious. "Who am I kidding?" she said to her reflection. "He'll probably just want to get the supplies and send me on my way." But as she turned off the light and settled into bed, Ruby couldn't shake a small flutter of curiosity about tomorrow's delivery. For the first time in months, she had something different to look forward to, even if it was just a brief encounter with a stranger who probably wouldn't give her a second thought. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with that particular quality of light that made Montana's big sky look infinite. Ruby loaded the delivery truck with feed sacks, fence posts, and various ranch supplies, her movements practiced despite the physical challenges her condition presented. She'd learned to adapt, using step stools and leverage to accomplish tasks that others took for granted. County Road 15 stretched through rolling hills dotted with cattle and bordered by split-rail fences that spoke of generations of careful stewardship. The Hawthorne Ranch sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, marked by a simple wooden sign that had weathered to a soft gray. As Ruby drove closer, she could see that the property was well maintained, fences in good repair, outbuildings that looked sturdy and functional, and a modest two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch that suggested comfort rather than ostentation. She parked near the barn and climbed out of the truck, immediately noticing the profound quiet of the place. No radio playing, no machinery running, just the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance and the whisper of wind through grass. It was peaceful in a way that made her tense shoulders relax slightly. "Hello," she called out, her voice seeming small in the vast space. "Mr. Hawthorne, I have your delivery from Miller's." A figure emerged from the barn, and Ruby's first impression was of someone perfectly suited to this landscape. Caleb Hawthorne was tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders and the kind of lean strength that came from physical work rather than gym workouts. His hair was dark brown with premature silver at the temples, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. What struck her most, though, were his eyes, a warm brown that seemed to take in everything without judgment. He approached the truck, and Ruby braced herself for the usual reaction, the slight double-take, the momentary confusion, the awkward adjustment of expectations. But Caleb simply nodded and said, "Thank you for bringing these out. I know it's quite a drive." His voice was deep and quiet, with a gentleness that surprised her. He began unloading the supplies, and Ruby moved to help, expecting him to wave her off or make some comment about her ability to handle the heavy items. Instead, he simply worked alongside her, adjusting his pace to match hers and instinctively positioning himself to make the work easier for both of them. "You don't talk much," Ruby observed after they'd worked in comfortable silence for several minutes. Caleb paused, holding a bag of feed, and gave her a small smile. "My father used to say that words are like water, precious in drought, dangerous in flood. I guess I learned to ration them." There was something in his tone that suggested a story behind those words, but Ruby didn't press. She was too surprised by how normal this felt, working alongside someone who didn't seem to notice or care about her differences. "Your ranch is beautiful," she said, gesturing toward the rolling pastures, where black cattle grazed peacefully. "Thank you. It's been in my family for 3 generations, though I'm probably the last." There was no self-pity in his voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that made Ruby curious about his story. As they finished unloading, Caleb said, "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot, and it's a long drive back to town." Ruby hesitated. Part of her wanted to accept, drawn by his quiet kindness and the peaceful atmosphere of the ranch. But another part, the part that had been hurt too many times, whispered warnings about getting too comfortable, about misreading kindness for something more. "I should probably get back," she said, though the words felt wrong as soon as she spoke them. Caleb nodded, not pushing, but she caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or understanding. Another time, perhaps. As Ruby drove back toward town, she found herself thinking about those few words. Another time, perhaps. They suggested a future, a possibility, and that was more than most people offered her. She realized that in the entire interaction, Caleb had never once stared at her body, never shown any sign of discomfort or pity. He had simply treated her like a person, and that was so rare it felt almost revolutionary. The week that followed was ordinary in most ways, the usual routine of work, the familiar patterns of small-town life. But Ruby found herself thinking about the ranch, about the quiet man who moved through his day with such purposeful calm. When Mrs. Miller mentioned that the Hawthorne ranch needed another delivery the following week, Ruby volunteered before she could think better of it. "Are you sure, dear?" Mrs. Miller asked, studying Ruby's face with the shrewd awareness of someone who had watched her struggle with confidence for 3 years. "It's quite a drive, and the weather's supposed to turn." "I don't mind," Ruby said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. That evening, she stood in front of her mirror again, but this time she wasn't practicing words. Instead, she found herself wondering what Caleb saw when he looked at her. He hadn't stared at her legs, hadn't shown any of the usual discomfort that people displayed around her difference. For the first time in years, Ruby allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, someone could see past her physical limitations to whatever lay beneath. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The second delivery came during a week when Martinez weather decided to remind everyone who was really in charge. Dark clouds rolled across the big sky like moving mountains, and the wind carried the promise of early snow. Ruby made the drive to the Hawthorne ranch with a thermos of hot coffee and a small flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. This time, when she pulled up to the barn, Caleb was waiting for her, as if he'd been watching for the delivery truck. He wore a heavy canvas jacket and wore gloves, but his greeting was the same, a quiet nod and an immediate move to help with the supplies. "Storm's coming in fast," he observed, glancing at the sky as they worked. "You shouldn't drive back in this weather." Ruby looked up at the clouds, which had grown darker and more ominous in just the few minutes since she'd arrived. The wind was picking up, carrying the first few snowflakes of what promised to be a significant storm. "I'll be fine," she said automatically, though the truth was that her small car wasn't great in snow, and the mountain roads could be treacherous. Caleb studied her face for a moment, then said simply, "No, you won't be. Coffee's still on, and I've got a guest room. You can wait it out." It wasn't really a question, and Ruby found herself both grateful and terrified by the prospect of spending extended time with this man who confused all her expectations about how people treated her. She followed him to the farmhouse, noting how he shortened his naturally long stride to match her pace, without making it obvious. The interior of the house was as thoughtfully maintained as the exterior, clean and comfortable without being fancy, with furniture that looked built to last and books that showed signs of being read rather than displayed. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the kitchen smelled like bread and coffee. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," Caleb said, gesturing toward the living room. "I'll get the coffee." Ruby chose a chair by the fire, grateful for its warmth as the wind howled outside with increasing intensity. When Caleb returned with 2 steaming mugs, she noticed that he'd chosen the sofa rather than the chair closest to her, giving her space without making her feel isolated. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "For the coffee and for this." "Nothing to thank me for. Montana, weather doesn't care about anyone's schedule." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire and listening to the storm grow stronger outside. Ruby kept stealing glances at her host, trying to understand what made him so different from other people she'd encountered. There was something peaceful about his presence, a lack of the restless energy that seemed to drive most people to fill every silence with words. "Can I ask you something?" Ruby said finally, the words coming out before she could second-guess herself. Caleb looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "Of course. Why don't you? I mean, most people when they first meet me." She struggled with how to phrase the question without sounding like she was fishing for compliments or pity. "Why don't I stare?" Caleb asked gently. Ruby nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "My younger brother was born with spina bifida," he said finally. "Danny was in a wheelchair his whole life, and I watched how people treated him. Some stared, some looked away, but very few just saw him. He was the smartest, funniest person I knew, but most people never got past the wheelchair to find that out." "Was?" Ruby asked softly, picking up on the past tense. "Car accident when he was 22. Drunk driver ran a red light." Caleb's voice remained steady, but Ruby could see the old pain in his eyes. "Danny always said that people who couldn't see past his legs weren't worth knowing anyway. I guess that stuck with me." Ruby felt tears prick her eyes, both for his loss and for the unexpected gift of understanding he was offering her. "I'm sorry," she said. "Me too. But he taught me that the most important things about a person can't be seen from the outside. Intelligence, kindness, humor, strength. None of that shows up in someone's appearance." "I've never thought about it that way," Ruby admitted. "What way do you think about it?" The question was asked without pressure, but Ruby found herself wanting to answer honestly. "I think about how my legs look crooked when I walk, how my body takes up space in ways that make people uncomfortable, how I'll never be beautiful in any way that matters." Caleb set down his coffee mug and leaned forward slightly. "Can I tell you what I see when I look at you?" Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs, but she nodded. "I see someone who drives through mountain storms to make sure people get what they need. Someone who works quietly and efficiently without complaining about tasks that are probably harder for you than for most people. Someone with expressive eyes and a smile that shows up even when you're trying to hide it." He paused, then added, "I see someone who's been told she's not beautiful so many times that she believes it, but who radiates something much more valuable than conventional prettiness." Ruby stared at him, hardly able to process what she was hearing. "You don't even know me." "I know enough. I know you volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends. Mrs. Miller mentioned it. I know you remember exactly how everyone in town likes their coffee because I've watched you at the store. I know you're kind to children, even when their parents are less than kind to you." Caleb's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were listing obvious truths. "Those things matter more than leg shape or height or any of the other things people fixate on." Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but inside the warm farmhouse, Ruby felt something shifting in her chest, a small crack in the wall she'd built around her heart, letting in the first ray of light she'd allowed herself to feel in years. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything. Just maybe consider the possibility that you've been looking in the wrong mirrors." The storm lasted through the night, blanketing the ranch in 18 inches of pristine snow that transformed the landscape into something from a fairy tale. Ruby woke in the guest room to the sound of silence, that particular quiet that comes after a snowfall, when the world seems wrapped in cotton and possibility. She'd slept better than she had in months, wrapped in quilts that smelled like lavender and lulled by the storm's retreat into gentle whispers. As she made her way downstairs, she could smell bacon and coffee, and she found Caleb in the kitchen, moving around with the easy competence of someone comfortable with domestic tasks. "Morning," he said, looking up from a stove. "Hope you like pancakes." I figured you'd need something substantial before digging out from all this snow. Ruby stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, this tall, quiet man making breakfast in his cozy kitchen, treating her presence as natural and welcome rather than an inconvenience. It felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. I should call Mrs. Miller and let her know I'm okay, Ruby said, pulling out her phone. Already did. Told her you were safe and would be back when the roads were clear. She said to tell you not to worry about the store. Her nephew's covering for you today. The casual way he'd taken care of that detail, anticipating her concern and handling it without being asked, made Ruby's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It had been so long since anyone had looked out for her in such a thoughtful way. Over breakfast, they talked more easily than Ruby had talked to anyone in years. Caleb told her about the ranch, about his plans to expand into organic beef production, about the books he read during long winter evenings. She found herself sharing things she rarely discussed: her love of photography, her secret dream of traveling to places she'd only seen in magazines, her struggle to find clothes that fit properly, and her frustration with a world designed for people taller than her. "Why don't you pursue photography seriously?" Caleb asked, refilling her coffee cup. Ruby shrugged, a gesture that had become automatic whenever anyone touched on her dreams. "Who's going to hire a photographer who looks like me? People want their wedding pictures taken by someone glamorous, not someone who has to stand on a stepladder to get the right angle. So do something else. Nature photography, animal portraits, maybe work for the tourism board. Montana's full of beautiful things that don't care what the photographer looks like." It was such a simple observation, but it hit Ruby like a revelation. She'd been so focused on what she couldn't do that she'd never seriously considered what she could do. "I've never thought about it that way. Maybe it's time to start." After breakfast, they bundled up and went outside to assess the snow situation. Ruby's car was completely buried, but Caleb's truck could handle the drifts once they cleared the driveway. As they worked together with shovels, Ruby was surprised to find herself laughing at Caleb's dry observations about Montana weather and enjoying the physical challenge of the work. "You know," she said, pausing to catch her breath, "I never thought I'd enjoy shoveling snow." "It's different when you're not doing it alone," Caleb replied, and there was something in his tone that made Ruby look at him more closely. "Are you lonely out here?" she asked impulsively. Caleb leaned on his shovel, considering the question. "I thought I preferred solitude, but these past 2 days, I'd forgotten how nice it is to have someone to talk to. Someone who listens." They finished clearing the driveway in comfortable silence, and as Caleb loaded a bag of sand in the truck bed for traction, Ruby found herself reluctant to leave. The ranch had begun to feel like a refuge, and Caleb's presence had given her a glimpse of what it might feel like to be valued for who she was rather than judged for what she wasn't. "Ruby," Caleb said as they stood by her now uncovered car, "would you maybe like to come back sometime? When there's not a storm, I mean. I could show you around the property. Maybe take you to the pond where the wildlife comes to drink. Might be good for photography." Ruby's heart hammered in her chest. This felt like more than just a casual invitation. It felt like possibility, like the beginning of something she'd never dared to hope for. "I'd like that," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Good. I'll call the store when I need supplies. Make sure you're the one who brings them." As Ruby drove back to town, following the path Caleb's truck had carved through the snow, she caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, she didn't immediately focus on her flaws. Instead, she saw what Caleb might see: a woman with bright eyes and a genuine smile, someone who was perhaps more interesting than she'd given herself credit for. That evening, alone in her apartment, Ruby dug out the digital camera she'd bought years ago but rarely used. She scrolled through the few pictures she'd taken, mostly of the town's cats and dogs, during her volunteer work at the animal shelter. They weren't professional quality, but there was something in them, a warmth, a way of capturing personality, that made her wonder if Caleb might be right about her having an eye for this kind of work. She thought about his words, about looking in different mirrors, and realized that for most of her life, she'd been using the wrong reflection to judge her worth. She'd been looking in the mirror of society's narrow beauty standards instead of the mirror of her own capabilities, kindness, and strength. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Thanks for the company during the storm. Looking forward to that photography expedition. Caleb." Ruby stared at the message, reading it 3 times before the reality sank in. Someone was looking forward to spending time with her. Someone saw her as worth knowing, worth being around. For the first time in her adult life, Ruby allowed herself to imagine a future that included not just acceptance, but genuine connection, maybe even love. It was a terrifying and wonderful thought, and as she fell asleep that night, she found herself smiling at the ceiling, thinking about wide open spaces and quiet voices and the revolutionary idea that beauty might have nothing to do with the shape of her legs after all. 6 months later, Ruby's photography business was thriving in ways she'd never imagined possible. Her portfolio of Montana wildlife and landscape photography had caught the attention of the State Tourism Board, and she'd been commissioned to shoot a series of images for their new campaign, celebrating the state's natural beauty. More importantly, her relationship with Caleb had grown into something neither of them had expected, but both treasured. They discovered a compatibility that went far beyond physical attraction, shared values, complementary temperaments, and a deep respect for each other's independence and dreams. On a warm summer evening, they sat on Caleb's porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ruby had her camera in her lap, having just finished a session photographing the ranch's new calves, and Caleb was reading a book about sustainable farming practices. "I got a call today," Ruby said, setting down her camera and turning to face him. "The Wildlife magazine wants to send me to Yellowstone for a week to shoot their fall issue." Caleb looked up from his book, his face lighting up with genuine pride. "That's incredible, Ruby. You deserve it." "The thing is," she continued, "they specifically requested me because they said my work has a unique perspective. They said I capture things other photographers miss." "They're right," Caleb said simply. "You see beauty where other people don't think to look." Ruby smiled, remembering the scared, insecure woman who had stood in Miller's General Store 6 months ago, convinced that love and recognition were things that happened to other people. That woman felt like a stranger now, not because Ruby's appearance had changed, but because her understanding of her own worth had been revolutionized. "I used to think my legs were crooked," she said, echoing the words that had once defined her self-image. "I used to think I'd never be beautiful." Caleb reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. And now, Ruby looked out at the vast Montana landscape that had become her canvas, then at the man who had helped her see herself through new eyes. "Now I think beauty has more to do with how you move through the world than how the world sees you move." As the stars came out one by one over the big sky, Ruby reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd learned that true love wasn't about finding someone who overlooked her differences, but about finding someone who valued her completely. Curves, proportions, limitations, and all. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Ruby raised her camera to capture the silhouette of Caleb against the starlit sky. Through her lens, she saw not just a tall, quiet rancher, but a man who had given her the greatest gift imaginable, the knowledge that she was worthy of love exactly as she was. And in that knowledge, Ruby had finally found the beauty she'd been seeking all along, not in her reflection, but in her own courageous heart. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.